Hi, welcome to the EUC channel. These are short tutorials, based on the prerequisites for Horizon Cloud on Azure. In this session we will look at some of the network integration and setup required to get you to a minimum, but successful deployment within the Horizon Cloud on Azure. We need to start by creating a Microsoft Azure Virtual Network, or VNet for short. Choose the Microsoft Azure region with an applicable address space to cover required subnets. This needs to be set up for each pod and region you want to deploy Horizon Cloud on Azure into. You will need to create 3 non-overlapping address ranges inside a format within the pod's VNet that is reserved for subnets. First, create the DMZ subnet with a minimum of /28. Next, create the management subnet with a /27-sider address that will accommodate all the management components. Lastly, create the VM subnet, or known as the primary tenant network, with a preferred 22-sider address that will accommodate future growth. Subnets can either be created manually on the VNet or by Horizon Cloud during deployment. If using manually created subnets, no other resources can be attached. It's important to follow the prerequisites document to ensure all the correct services for each network segment have been enabled, and that your line of sight to Active Directory, DNS services, and possible NAT and PAT rules have been considered when designing the pod network. Don't forget about the external IPs that will require you to map your FQDNs to UAGs. We will need a public certificate and mapping ready to be used by the universal broker, but this is not required for the first part of your deployment. Don't give your UAG URLs to users just yet. Wait until you have set up the Universal Broker and Workspace ONE components as part of your deployment. Creating an entry point with single sign-on and a universal catalog for all your users will save you a lot of time and money on configuration changes, and no longer require messing about with GSLB for your users in multiple regions, and with access requirements to multiple pods. When deploying the external Unified Access Gateway into its own VNet, separate from the pod's VNet, then create that Unified Access Gateway virtual network in the same Microsoft Azure region as the pod's VNet. Once again, make sure you have enough capacity in the subnet for the services. Peer the 2 VNets to make sure they can communicate. Have a look at how we create a VNet. Log into your Azure portal and click on the virtual networks. We still start with a manual creation of the VNet by adding a virtual network to the subscription and resource group that we intend to use for our deployment. My subscription is already selected, but you can change this by using the drop-down menu. Create a new resource group for our VNet setup. Use a friendly name for the instance name, and make sure the region selected will be the deployment region. If you deploy multiple regions and multiple pods, then keep on repeating this process until all your networks have been created. The IP addresses tab is the entire virtual network range. We use this to set the IP address space, and then divide this address into subnets. Those subnets will be the subnets used for the DMZ, management, and tenant network when we start the deployment. Remember, we do not need to create the subnets, as the deployment engine can create this for us. This is to show you how a subnet will be created with a friendly name and an IP range. The service endpoint will be used to register the PostgreSQL service or any other required services for that particular subnet. Make sure you follow the documentation for the latest security advice. Feel free to add tags at this stage. Once validation past the virtual network we created within a new resource group can now be created. Now that the VNet has been set up, we can also change or create our own DNS servers for this virtual network. Do not change or update these settings during your deployment. Make sure this is done before or after. If you change DNS servers, a reboot of virtual machines may be required. The last step is to pair the newly created VNet with our resource networks that require Active Directory, DNS, and other services we internally deployed. Select to add a new pairing and specify a friendly name from one VNet to the other, and the same for the reverse name. We also want to allow all traffic to and from the other network. Make sure you select the correct subscription and remote virtual network to pair with. The VNet pairing is in place and connected. Let's have a look at my internal VNet that is now paired to the newly created VNet for the Horizon deployment. We can see the Core 2 Central Germany pairing is in place and connected. We opted not to use the gateway transit in this overview, and will cover that in our advanced topics. You can use the diagram function to visually familiarize yourself with an overview of the connections created within a VNet. Enable the PowerShell module. Now connect to your Azure AD. We use the first command to create a resource group in the current subscription within a region we specify. UK South is our choice for this resource group. A couple of lines of code and our VNet and subnets are created. We not only created one VNet, but we also created as many VNets in as many resource groups and regions as we would require for our pods. Each VNet creation can include all the details for the subnets, the DNS entries, and any services you wish to enable on your subnets. Once your VNets are created, put the pairing in place between networks that require access to traffic from other networks. Refresh the page and let's have a look at the UK South network. You can see how quickly we created multiple VNets and multiple subnets all at the same time. This is very cool, but unless you are destroying data centers every hour or weekly, the creation of these VNets only needs to be done once. Looking at our core VNet, we can see that all the pairings are in place and connected successfully. Your network setup has been successful for your Horizon Cloud on Azure deployment. Once you have all your required networks in place, continue to the next step. Thank you for watching.